Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so pleased that you all made it out on this rainy evening to participate in the first-year reading experience, Missoula Big Read author event, our keynote speech with Tim O'Brien discussing the things they carried. So my name is Megan Stark, and I'm the chair of the first-year reading experience. And I just want to acknowledge that many people contributed tonight to this event, including the amazing members of the First Year Reading Experience Committee, the Office of the Provost, the Office of the President, the Missoula Public Library, and of course the greater Missoula community. My heartfelt thanks to every single person involved in bringing this wonderful book and author to our campus. The participation of Missoula and the campus indicates to me that the belief that reading is a powerful act of community building is one that truly ties us all together. And so again, I welcome you and hope that you enjoy the evening. Go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for joining us to take part in the Big Read 2014. I'm Mary Drew Powers from Missoula Public Library. The Big Read is Missoula's month-long celebration of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. The Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest, and it's designed to revitalize the role of reading in the American culture. This community-wide effort is made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts and the generous support of Missoula Public Library's Big Read partners, with special thanks to our Big Read sponsors. So please visit readmissoula.org for a full listing of all those partners and sponsors, because the Big Read is truly a community endeavor. So the capstone event for the Big Read is tomorrow night at DraftWorks from 5 to 8. Please join us for a special Cheers for Charity event. We invite you all to come and enjoy the music of Bob Wire and lift a pint to The Things They Carried. And DraftWorks will donate a portion of the proceeds to the Valor House, a transitional housing program for veterans. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And to introduce Tim O'Brien, Professor Kwan Ha.
Good evening. I am Kwan Ha, Assistant Professor of English at the University of Montana, and thank you for being here this evening for this special event on Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. I talked to Tim earlier, and he said that I am the second Vietnamese to introduce him during his career, so I'm very honored. This famous war novel is selected for the first-year reading experience Big Read at this semester to help students gain a better understanding of warfare, human sufferings, and the unweighed spiritual burdens such as fears and traumatic memories caused by war. Tim O'Brien was born in Minnesota and graduated with a BA in political science from Macalester College in 1968. He served a tour in Vietnam in 1969 and 1970 as an infantryman and briefly attended Harvard University after returning from Vietnam. O'Brien is a prolific, indefatigable writer and has published 8 novels. In 1979, he was awarded the National Book Award for the novel Going After Cacciato, and his book, The Things They Carried, a collection of short stories about the Vietnam War, was awarded the Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize and was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. O'Brien is currently a professor of creative fiction at Texas State University in San Marcos. Selected short stories from The Things They Carried have been widely anthologized in textbooks on American literature and war literature. O'Brien is considered one of the best American writers of the 20th century, and he has given book talks at several colleges and universities nationwide. His novels have attracted substantial attention from critics and scholars internationally. Hundreds of articles and academic books discuss his novel, especially The Things They Carried. And it is impossible to exclude O'Brien from the political and cultural discourse on U.S. literature of warfare. The significance of this novel within the corpus of postmodern American literature is ineffable because it has established itself as an interpreter of contemporary American life and culture. OBrien is often placed on the same pedestal with Hemingway and Kurt Vonnegut. The Things They Carried exposes the universal brutality of war, condemned the political agendas that have victimized thousands of soldiers and civilians on both sides of the conflict, portrayed the devastation of Vietnam and the dislocation of the Vietnamese, and emphasizes the soldiers' physical, psychological, and emotional wounds during the war and its aftermath. OBrien has described the universal dimensions of the things they carried in an interview as follows, quote, "The title is meant to refer to all of us. It's about the spiritual, the emotional, and the psychological baggage we all carry. You sort of accumulate more and more of these spiritual burdens the longer you live, and they help define who you are, what our yearnings are, what makes us happy, and what doesn't," unquote. Last year, The Things They Carried was translated into the Vietnamese, and it is probably the first American novel about the Vietnam War, written from the American perspective, to be published in Vietnam legally. The translation of this novel helped the Vietnamese reading public understand more about the Vietnam War from the other side, their former enemy. Upon its initial release in the Vietnamese, OBrien's novel was highly praised for its theme of courage and cowardice, the lingering effects of war trauma, anti-war sentiments, and the artistic integration of history, personal experiences, and fiction into the narrative, and the search for literary form that can adequately convey the horrors of war. In his book, Rewriting America, Vietnam Authors in a Generation, literary critic Philip Bader wrote, quote, "We can truly be transformed and even possibly redeemed by electing to write at times of what happened, but also of what might have happened, what could have happened, what should have happened, but also what can be kept from happening or what can be made to happen. Words are all we have," unquote. Thus, let us be transformed and redeemed by the power of rhetoric, imagination, and the nature of good storytelling of our honorable special guest speaker this evening. Please join me in welcoming Tim OBrien to the stage. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Well, what a great pleasure to be here, and so great to have an introduction from someone from Vietnam. In our discourse about Vietnam, especially among veterans, unfortunately, the Vietnamese are usually excluded from the discussion as if we had no enemy, as if there were not another side to the conflict. 3 million Vietnamese died in that war. 60,000 Americans. Look at the percentages, the proportions of it all. The suffering was largely on that side. I am honored, I'm flattered, and I'm scared to death to be up here tonight. The honored and the flattered part, I know you understand, but I'm going to start with the scared stuff. When I began thinking about this talk, I was very quickly reminded that one of the reasons that I became a fiction writer, as opposed to a nonfiction writer, was that I would not be required to know anything, that I could just make it all up. If you don't know it, invent it. And I don't mean that entirely in a facetious sense, especially tonight. I mean pretty literally that I have very little to offer you in the way of those abstractions or generalizations that are so common on occasions such as this one. In fact, I really don't trust them much. For every generalization I hear, I instantly think of an exception, which to me is more interesting than the generalization itself. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not an historian, I'm not a public speaker by trade. I'm not Bill O'Reilly or Chris Matthews or Howard Stern. I'm not even Tony Danza. I'm a novelist and I'm a storyteller, which in a most important ways, a novelist and a storyteller is the exact reverse of what I'm doing right now, a speech giver. A good story is concrete. It's not abstract. A good story is specific. These characters, that situation, that love affair, that dead person, and no other. A good story, in my view at least, does not moralize, it does not preach at you, and it does not offer advice about how to live your life. What's the moral of Hansel and Gretel? Your silence is my answer. What's the moral of Thumbelina? Eat your carbohydrates? There is none, not in that sense. The story just is. It informs us without directing us by the nose, taking us to a destination, moral or otherwise. Abstractions and generalizations will make your head believe something if they're well presented. Your brain will believe. But a good story, I think, will also make your stomach believe. A good story is aimed not just at the intellect, but also at your blood, at your tear ducts, at your spine, at the nape of your neck, at the back of your throat, at your funny bone, at your sad bone. A story is aimed at the whole human being. You respond to a story not just with your intellect, but with your body, if the story appeals to you. From the time I was a little boy of 8 or 9 years old, I've been a fervent believer in the power of story in our lives. And I don't mean just the stories that are written down. I mean the stories that our moms and dads told us when we were children. I mean the stories sometimes that we do read in books, Alice in Wonderland or Thumbelina. But I'm also talking about the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives late at night, 2 in the morning, and you can't sleep, and you're looking back on your high school days, and something went wrong or something went right at that prom that night, and there's a little story unraveling in your head about your behavior, maybe something good you did or something not so good. It's the story you tell yourself. Stories have the power to help us understand where we've been and where we might be going. Stories heal, stories console, stories encourage us and embolden us to step out of ourselves and be better. Stories help us to see the world freshly, hear it freshly, but above all, to feel freshly. Stories give us access to other people's lives, and thereby fresh access to our own lives. Stories help us feel a little less alone in this depressing, sometimes terrifying universe we all live in. Stories offer us late-night company, escorting us through the bleak hours of our lives when we can't remember how we got from where we were to where we are. It's just forgotten. And a story is like a companion through memory. Stories bind the past to the future, and ultimately stories remind us that we are all part of something universal and mysterious. That journey down the birth canal and out into the light and thence toward the grave. I am stuck. What do I do tonight? Well, after a whole bunch of false starts, I decided to try to do what I do best, which is, I hope, tell you a couple of stories in the hope that my underlying meaning and its relationship to the things they carried, the book, the Big Read book in Missoula, will soak through the stories. I don't like talking directly about my writing because it sounds a little bit like here's the author telling you how to read a book. When I wouldn't want to be told by an author, here's how you read my book. I'd want to read the book and make my own mind up about it. Before launching into these stories, though, I wanted to say a few words especially to the students here tonight. I know it's a mixture of faculty and townsfolk and students, but I wanted to direct just a few comments to the students here. As a professional writer, if the word professional is a strange word, I'm just a writer, I thought it would be my duty, at least, to offer you a few tips for your writing here at the University of Montana for classes and maybe afterward for those of you who want to become writers or even dreaming about becoming writers. So I came prepared with 4 pieces of advice, and these are the only abstractions or generalizations I'm going to offer. Number one, avoid ridiculous, flowery, decorative, long-winded language. For example, do not write this sentence. Her neck was like a swan's, long and arched and rubbery and graceful. Instead, write, she honked. It's sort of funny, but I also mean it. I mean, that would be an Alice in Wonderland story where somebody's honking at you. How are you? Number two, avoid excessive and falsely poetic alliteration. Do not write this sentence. The red, rollicking river of her tongue rubbed me the wrong way. Instead, write, she kissed me, I gagged. Number three, use active and not passive language. Show us, don't tell us. Do not write this boring, passive sentence. Jack had been happily married for 20 years. Instead, write, Jack turned on the TV, opened the Cheetos, sat back, and scratched himself. And fourth and finally, when writing fiction, do not be afraid to lie. For a fiction writer, lying, making stuff up, wholesale, is a great and a noble and a sublime virtue. It's good. After all, think about it. Fiction writers choose to invent stuff for a reason. Otherwise, there would be no fiction. Broadway would go dark, all the theaters would close in this country and across the world. Fathers would stop telling stories to their kids late at night. You wouldn't have any novels to read. Everything on television would be, well, it kind of already is reality pretty much, but it would all be that way. Hollywood would shut down. As a novelist and as a story writer, I am not limited by what happened. I can also write, as was mentioned eloquently in the introduction, about what almost happened. Not quite, but almost. Or what could have happened, but did not. Or what should have happened, but did not. I could have and I should have walked away from the war in Vietnam. I did not. I endured. I kept humping, as we called it. Even in the midst of an overwhelming human misery and human tragedy. As Pablo Picasso put it, much more eloquently than I, art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. Pretty beautifully said. In a sense, I've already begun talking kind of slyly about the things they carried. Issues such as, what does the word true mean? Can something be true one moment and untrue the next? What about the commandment, thou shalt not kill? Is it true? Well, it's told you in Worthington, Minnesota, where I grew up in Sunday school, and then you end up 14 years later in Vietnam and you're told you had better kill or we'll court-martial your ass. How can these two contradictory things, one a patriotic thing and the other a religious, how can they live in one, they're so different, contradictory, how can they live in your own soul? And how can you endure that contradiction? Not long ago, I should preface this, I'm going now into one of my stories. You're looking at a 68-year-old guy. I just turned 68, so I'm a youthful 68. I'm like 3 weeks into my 68th year, so I'm a young one. But I'm still pretty old. And I'm the father of two young kids. I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, my first and only kids. And not long ago, about, I'd say 2 years ago, something like that, I came across the younger kid, whose name is Tad, peeing into a wastebasket in our bathroom. And not just a wastebasket, but a wire mesh wastebasket. And and not just a wire mesh wastebasket, but a wire mesh wastebasket that was situated on top of a brand new maroon carpet that my wife had insisted we put in this bathroom. I told her, this is ridiculous, we've got little kids, but she put it in. Well, I saw the kid peeing into the wastebasket, and I said, why are you doing this? And I must say, I spoke pretty sharply. I try not to yell at my kids, but on this occasion, I came within a whisker of yelling, why are you doing this? My voice was earnest, to say the least. It was so earnest that Tad froze. He tried to turn away from the wastebasket to the toilet, but made it halfway and just right onto the carpet. The whole time I was saying, why are you doing this? Why are you? I mean, at the time he was, 7 years old. He knew better. I was furious. And my wife heard me almost yelling at the kid and came and took over the disciplining duties. I trotted back to my office and just muttering to myself that I couldn't believe this kid had done this. About an hour later, Tad came into my office and he said, Daddy, Daddy. And I said, what? And he said, I've got 2 heads. And I said, what? And he said, I've got 2 heads. And I said, what? He said, you asked why I did it. And it's because I have 2 heads. One head was thinking, Daddy's not going to like this. And the other head was thinking, this is going to be fun. Well, right away, I forgave the kid, as you would, as any parent would. I mean, that is a pretty sophisticated comment to come out of the mouth of a 7-year-old, 2 heads. A moment later, I was imagining him becoming a serial killer or a juvenile delinquent. And here's this amazing, view of the world. It's a sophisticated view of the world that prompted forgiveness. The story doesn't quite end there. That night, there's a ritual in my house. I'm a writer. And so instead of just reading stories to my kids aloud, which I do a little of, 90% of the time, I make up my own stories. And that night, I flanked by these 2 precious little boys. Tad's lying over here, the younger kid, and the 11-year-old. At the time, the older one was 9. Over here, and it's pitch black, and it's about 10 at night, and they should have been asleep 2 hours ago. And school's coming on the next day. And that night, I began a story. Once upon a time, I knew somebody with 2 heads. And in the dark, Tad sat up and kind of looked at me and said, really? And I said, yeah. And the other kid sat up and said, who? And I said his name was Daddy. And both kids kind of squinted at me in the black, like looking for the stump of the extra head that had once been there. And of course there was none. And then for, I don't know, maybe the next 20 minutes, half hour, I told them a sanitized, cleaned up, kind of Ajaxed version of one of the chapters in the things they carried, a chapter called On the Rainy River, which is the story of more or less what had happened to me in the summer of 1968, the summer I found myself drafted, the summer I became a soldier. One of my heads, I told the kid, then in bed that night, one of the heads was sort of located over here, and it was a patriotic head. It was a head that loved its country, respected authority, respected tradition, and believed in such virtues as duty and sacrifice and service to your nation. It was a Middle Western head. My dad had been a sailor in World War II in the South Pacific. My mom had been in the Navy in the waves. There was a tradition of doing what your country told you to do. But there was also a head on my shoulders that summer that also believed in these things, but at the same time found itself opposed to the war in Vietnam and wanted nothing to do with it. Certainly not the killing part, and even more certainly not the dying part. I was 21 years old. I was terrified. And through the summer of 1968, those two heads endlessly confronted each other, challenging and mocking each other and debating and cussing and invoking the names of God and Jesus and LBJ and Richard Nixon and Jane Fonda and Abby Hoffman and Donald Duck. Sometimes those two heads would speak quietly and rationally, one to the other. Other times, the heads would be screaming the most outlandish obscenities at each other, much as people were screaming their obscenities in the city streets of Chicago and LA and New York. Well, by this point, of course, Tad and Timmy were fast asleep. And I, the old dad, is lying in bed, flanked by these two incredible little kids, telling himself for the 1,000th time the story of two-headedness. The summer I found myself drafted, lying there in the dark. I wasn't speaking aloud anymore. I was now talking inside my head, telling the story in my thoughts and in my memory. And even now, I have to tell you tonight that 4 decades later, those two heads are still yapping away inside me. They were last night and they will tonight. Now and then, one head will score a sterile, rhetorical victory over the other, and other times, the other head will win. Sometimes one head might say to the other, "What a coward you were for going to that war. What a coward." And the other head will shake itself and say, "You did what your country told you to do." And the first head will laugh and say, "Yeah, but what if my country told me to go kill Canadians tomorrow? Should I just go to Toronto and start butchering them?" And the other head will say, "Give me a break. Your country would never ask you to do such a thing. You live in a good and great country. Don't be ridiculous. Don't just indulge in rhetoric." And the other head will say, "I'm not indulging in rhetoric. Is my country right about everything all the time? What about My Lai? What about the American Indian? What about slavery? What about robber barons? What about Hollywood blacklists? What about McCarthyism? What about a little village called My Lai with 400 dead babies and teenagers and old women, none of them combatants?" And the other head will say, "Come on, you can find flaws with everybody. Give me a break. Everybody makes mistakes." And the other head will say, "Exactly my point. Everybody makes mistakes." And on and on and on and on until one head will finally say to the other, "Come on, man, let's get some sleep." And then again, the next night, it begins all over. It strikes me now on this evening, where a whole community is reading a single book, that you in the audience, I'm speaking again largely to the students, but not entirely, may find yourselves at one point in your life engaging in two-headedness, much as I did. It may not be about a war. Maybe, should I marry Bill or should I marry Phil? And you're lying late at night, and another head says, "Forget both of them, marry Jill." And the other head, it may have to do with, should I go to graduate school or should I take a job? It can be about a lot of things, but at some point, in your lives, you're going to be where I was in the summer of 1968, with two heads talking at each other, on and on. Part of being an adult, part of being, I think, human, as opposed to, say, being a chipmunk, is that at certain points in our lives, we all carry on our shoulders 2 or maybe 3 or 4 or 5 heads. This can be a great curse. It can lead to that late night second guessing and so on, and wee hour remorse, endless speculation about what it could have been or should have been. 2 heads can be a problem. On the other hand, 2 heads can also be the sign of, open-mindedness, or a mind attuned to the world's pesky ambiguities and complexities, the confusions and ambiguities that make up the world we live in, which is not black and white. It's not rhetorically simple. To carry 2 heads through life, however burdensome it is, however dispiriting at times, may help to avoid the soul-killing, people-killing problem of absolutism. Muhammad Atta, the hijacker and pilot of one of those airliners that struck the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, had but 1 head, a bonehead at that, an absolutist of the most consummate and deadly sort. Atta thought he knew the final and definitive truth of things, a truth worth killing for and a truth worth dying for. He was a believer. Let us not, you and me, commit the same sin of vanity and fanaticism and complacency and self-righteousness and zealotry and demagoguery and simple-minded black and white, I'm right and you're wrong absolutism. In a sense, the things they carried, with its blurry lines between what happened and what almost happened, with the ambiguities built into that book, represents for me a warning about absolutism of whatever sort. I came home from Vietnam bearing not just a few lessons about the war, in fact, bearing almost none. I came home with few, as I mentioned earlier, abstractions or generalizations, but I made a little list in my hotel room this afternoon of what I did bring home and still carry through my life from that war, that I hope might be relevant to what's going on in your lives and in the world today. Some of these are very simple-minded, and they begin with this: dead bodies are awkward and they're heavy to carry. They feel dead. They don't just look dead, they feel that way. The tissues feel dead. And the longer they've been dead, the deader they feel. Number 2, if you support a war, go. I mean, it stuns me that only a few people are applauding that, but it strikes me that the opposite is utter hypocrisy. It's saying, yeah, I'm all for a war, let's go kill people, but I ain't going, and my son and daughter aren't going either. I'm tucking them away at Stanford or Yale or the University of Montana, and I'm not going to put blood where my rhetoric is. I'm not going to put my body where my mouth is. Where I come from, in southern Minnesota, that's called hypocrisy. I can't think of any other word for it. I remember in Vietnam, as we sat around our foxholes late at night, this was one of the main, this isn't a political point, this isn't Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, this is Nam talking to you. The late nights, and somebody who's died that day or been badly wounded. And we'll talk about the folks back home, and how People are on the airwaves and television sets in their, pinstriped suits and their fancy ties supporting the war, but they aren't there. We talk about, for example, politicians, say McNamara back then, a Secretary of Defense, claiming time and time again, there's light at the end of the tunnel, 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 over and over for months and years. There's light at the end of the tunnel. But he'd never been in a tunnel. There's usually an adjective that precedes the word tunnel that begins with an F and ends with a G. When I say that line, I'm not going to do it here, but you know what it is. It's the GI in me talking. You don't know there was no light in these tunnels. I'm talking about literal tunnels, but I'm also talking figuratively. Number 3, this has to do with sanitizing wars. Now, when I told my stories, this kid, my 2 little boys, the story of the Rainy River, I did sanitize it. But on the other hand, when I'm doing literature or trying to tell adults about the experience of war, I feel it's my obligation to be pretty blunt and to use the kind of lingo and sometimes the profanities that soldiers use. You can't have a character in a novel saying, "Oh, poop, I've been shot." There are many in America who want that. We laugh. I laugh at it too, but there are many who would prefer the books be written that way, like just sanitizing it. That goes for not just our country, I'm sure it's worldwide. No one wants to look at the ugliness and hear the ugliness. But at the same time, as a writer, I feel it's my obligation to try in some way or another to at least approximate truth, even if I'll never know exactly what it is. And one of the truths that I brought home with me is encapsulated in a sentence in the things they carried. If you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war, they will come home talking dirty. Next, this isn't even a lesson. I'm not even sure what exactly you call it. But it's this. It's very true that a bullet can kill the enemy. But a bullet can also manufacture an enemy. It can make one where one didn't exist before. Because if that bullet strikes a 5-year-old baby in the head, or kid, it's not a baby anymore, or an 8-year-old, or a 12-year-old, you've got one very angry mother and father and cousin and brother and sister and neighbor and friend. Just do the multiplication in your head. They may have been indifferent before, but they're not indifferent anymore, just as you wouldn't be indifferent anymore if your child were struck dead by a bullet. It has nothing to do with politics, Marxism, nothing to do. It has to do with your dead child lying there, just as I picture my little kid Tad lying dead with a bullet in his head. I'd be angry. And it would have nothing to do with politics. You would have made an enemy. So watch out. It's true that bombs and bullets can sometimes achieve our purposes, but sometimes they can do the exact reverse. Bear it in mind. I watched it happen during my whole tour in Vietnam, going into villages, searching them. And if we take any fire at all, we'd back out of the village, we'd call in the gunships and the artillery, and the village would fry. Everything in it, the chickens, the pigs, the children, the old ladies, they just all died or was badly hurt. It wasn't the war that I grew up learning about through my dad and my mom, World War II, where there were clear lines, where there was a destination. We're heading for Tokyo, we're heading for Berlin. Vietnam wasn't that any more than Afghanistan and Iraq is today. Mine was not a war where you even knew who your enemy was until they began shooting at you. There were no uniforms. The population was all around us, and unless they were shooting at you, you didn't know whom to shoot back at. It was a war in which landmines were causing most of our casualties. Well, how do you shoot back at a landmine? It's already dead. You can't kill it. But it was killing us, blowing us up. It wasn't that sort of John Wayne, Audie Murphy narrative that we took out of World War II, where there was clear right and wrong, and there were clear battle lines. There was an enemy you could see. That was not that kind of war at all. Now, I've been looking at I came prepared with way too much to talk about tonight, and I promised I would go for about 40 minutes or so and take questions for the rest of the time. I actually had another whole story I'd prepared to talk to you about tonight, but I won't do that. Instead, I'd rather spend my time now listening to you and hearing whatever comments or questions you might have, and doing what the Big Read is really all about, which is a kind of a dialogue between an author and an audience, which is you. So I'll stop. Thank you for coming, and I hope you have questions. Thank you. I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to handle this. What should we do? Does people come up here? Or is there a microphone?
All right, so we have 15 minutes, and if you want to ask questions, please just slide behind the microphone, and then
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Jim Hamilton,
Hi.
Delta Company.
I know.
5th Battalion,
I
46th.
5th to the 46th,
That's
my
right,
unit. Yeah.
198th.
I know.
Rich Cacciato was my company commander. He sends greetings.
Good. Greetings back.
He's still waiting for his autographed copy of your
Is
book.
he really?
I brought a copy for you to
Good.
sign. My
Just
question,
explain to the audience who Cacciato was so they know.
Richard Cacciato, when I got to the Americal a little later than Tim did. And I think Tim must have been the S1 or something, because he was the information officer for the Professional, and you were the the writer, the editor.
Right.
When I got to Vietnam, I ran into one of my OCS buddies, Bob Whiteside, who was in Alpha Company, and I think that's where you were.
Right.
And he got me over to Delta Company because Rich, apparently, he did it ass backwards. He went from staff to command.
He went the other way.
Most do the other way, but he was, Richard Cacciato was a captain that was the company commander in Delta Company. And he was really a good guy, and I was really lucky to have him.
Yep.
He just retired, by the way.
Oh, did he?
He did go to Paris. He
did,
He was
finally,
he was
good.
a wine merchant, lives in Scarsdale, New York. And I'll talk to you more at the end. My question is, my reading group, which half of them are professors from the school, we read your book 2 years ago, and I about fell over when I got to about the page 5, and I realized where you were, and I thought, how could I have been this stupid? But the burning question that we've had is, what became of Marianne Bell? And if she's still alive, is she back to wearing culottes?
What became of who?
Marianne Bell, the sweetheart
Oh, yeah.
of Song Bang Chong.
Well, like all fictional characters, she's pretty dead.
Well, she left the special. She left the greenies.
She never even got to be alive.
Well, we were just kind of curious, but
That's a great. I mean, I'll talk about that in a second. That's a great question. Thank you.
anyway, thank you.
I want to start with the Cacciato thing. This is weird how life kind of brings people together, a continent, in this case, half a world away. I wrote a book called Going After Cacciato, which I stole this real human being's name. His last name is Cacciato. Unfortunately, I attached Cacciato as a character who walks away from Vietnam, deserts and heads for Paris. Enough of this killing, I'm out of here. And it's a story of walking away from a war and some soldiers who were dispatched to bring him back. So this book did really well, won the National Book Award, it really did unbelievably well. So much so that a good friend of mine, another terrific writer, I think, named Philip Caputo, who wrote A Rumor of War, was in a bar in New York with his editor, and they were talking about Cacciato. And the real Rich Cacciato, the one that was just mentioned, was sitting in the next booth, listening to this conversation about Cacciato. And he knew who I was and so on. He came over the booth and he said, I have to cuss now, but it's not me, it's Cacciato. He said, you tell that goddamn OBrien I ain't no deserter, and I never was. He was really, all I did was steal his name. I didn't like steal his life, but I just borrowed his name. It's like you couldn't use Smith because there are too many Smiths out there. Anyway, so there's that anecdote. That's one of the things that, if you're going to be a writer, watch out. You know, I'm not sure I'd ever. Cacciato is a kind of an uncommon name. Anyway, Marianne Bell. Marianne, again, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a story called Sweetheart of the Song Trebong, about a soldier who one day brings his girlfriend from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, over to the war. That sends her a ticket, basically, and brings her over. And she arrives one day in a helicopter at a place called the Trebong Special Forces Camp out in the middle of nowhere in these big, spooky, fog-filled, dangerous mountains. And she lands at the Special Forces Camp, and over the next 15 pages of the story, she's slowly seduced by the war, by danger, and by proximity to danger. This adage, you know, you're never more alive than when you're almost dead, that your whole body is full of electricity, and you listen to your heartbeat in a different way, and you listen to the night in a different way when you're always almost dead. And she is seduced by the war. Well, where did the story come out of? It came out of a couple of sources. One is I just heard the story when I got to Alpha Company, 5th of the 46th. I heard it from several guys. I didn't believe it, and I'd hear it again, still didn't believe it. Thought, that's impossible. A woman up at a Special Forces camp, and especially a young, good-looking cheerleader from Cleveland Heights. And then I'd heard it again and again. I still didn't believe it. Then I came back from the war, and I was in Seattle at an event maybe 5 times the size of this. Is a huge event, so imagine this huge auditorium full of people. And a guy mentioned during a session, just like the one we're having right now, came up and said, did you ever hear this? This is at the microphone. Did you ever hear the story of this woman at a Special Forces camp? I said, yeah. I had not yet written my own story. So I heard it from enough sources where it could be true. I mean, I didn't actually see her. But I haven't seen George W. Bush in the flesh, and I believe he exists, and he's not made up. I mean, I believe he exists. So I wanted to write a story based on maybe it was true, maybe not. I don't really care if it really happened or not. I just wanted to write a story about what would happen to a woman of my age, almost exactly, ends up in Vietnam. Would she behave differently? Would she comport herself better than I did? Would she be more peaceful and nonviolent than I was? How would she behave? And I just wanted to put a woman in my boots and march her into a story. And what happens in the story essentially is she ends up pretty much as I did. She was seduced by the war, the way I kind of was. I hated it, but my eyes didn't hate it. My eyes were the sheets of metal fire coming out of the sky at night when a thing we called spooky would just eradicate the earth with gunfire. And I think it was like 1 bullet every 2 inches, and over a football field in about 3.5 seconds. And your eyes are commanded by it, much as your eyes are commanded by a forest fire. Here in Montana, you hate it and it's dangerous, but you can't help but look at it. Or cancer under a microscope. So there's the story about it. The story is not just based on that, though. The story is also based on a real person. I mentioned her this afternoon when I met with another smaller group of first-year students. It's a woman named Lady Borton, L-A-D-Y is her first name. She, too, is from Ohio. She was a Quaker, and she was in Vietnam exactly when I was, where I was. She was worked in Quang Ngai City. which is not really a city. I mean, in the way it's a town, and not even a very big town, but a dangerous place. All of Quang Ngai province was dangerous, I thought. And she lived there all by herself, without weaponry and nobody to, protect her. In a place where, 100 of us, a company of us, we'd be on the lookout if we went into that place. We'd be afraid, landmines, and who knows what's going to happen. So 40 years go by, all us macho guys, we're all home, walking in our 4th of July parades and Veterans Day parades, and guess what? She's still there. 4 decades later, when all us pot-bellied, nostalgic vets are back here, just as Marianne Bell was sucked into that war, lost herself in it, so did Lady Borton in a good way. She's still doing her human, work with refugees, trying to help poor people. And it's a way the story is an homage to a real person, which is, she's a writer, by the way, too. She wrote a book called After Sorrow that's probably in the library, in either the public library here or in the college library, and university library. It's amazing meeting somebody who served exactly where you did. I mean, that's just amazing. Yes, sir. I can't see that far.
Mr. O'Brien,
yes.
Good evening. My name is Hugo Keesing. On Memorial Day 2013, President Obama stood in front of the wall in Washington and announced the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War commemoration, a period of several years in which the veterans would be recognized for their service, etc. A couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the New York Times, I think Tom Hayden was the author, that said that this federally funded commemoration period was beginning to look like a whitewash. If you're familiar with the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War commemoration potential program, is it something that you could support? Do you think that they would invite you to be on their speakers list? And if you were invited, would you do so?
They'd never invite me.
That would be an honor, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not the kind of person they would invite. I'm a storyteller, and they're more interested, I think, in politicians and political, angles on the war and, kind of veterans' rights stuff. I walk a really hard line. I am not a soldier. I'm a writer, and I have been ever since Vietnam was, a little over a year of my life, and I've been a writer for 40 years. I treat the war now as the way maybe Joseph Conrad treated the ocean. Or is a source of, he was, captain on a ship, and he went through typhoons, but we don't think of Conrad as an ocean guy. We don't call Joseph Conrad the famous sailor. He's a famous writer. And so that's why I think I probably wouldn't be asked to speak there, and I'm not sure I would know what to say if I were asked. It's impossible to see here.
Sorry.
Okay, there you are.
In 2007, PBS produced a documentary called Operation Homecoming, which focused on different men and women who produced small poems or small stories about their experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you think it would be beneficial for the VA and Wounded Warriors Project to promote our men and women coming home who feel they've lost their voice to produce their own maybe stories or poems to maybe bring out their inner voice that they feel that normal citizens like us don't really care about?
Yeah, I do. Again, I'm not a politician, so I can't speak to how that would work socially and so on, but on a human level, I can say that when I'm writing about my war, I'm writing not just about a war. I'm writing about being a human being in any tragic circumstance. It could be in a concentration camp. It could be in a bad marriage. You could be trapped in a job you hate but you can't get out of, and the burdens that you carry from it. And by writing about it, I feel I'm sort of lightening the load a little bit. I'm getting it out of me and onto the page. A little bit. It's still always going to be there, but a little lighter. In a way, that's kind of what literature in general, I think, is for. It's what storytelling is for. It's to relieve some pressure on our psyches, where the burden is a little lighter. As I said in my introduction, you're sharing it with late-night company. I'll tell you an anecdote that's, I think, exactly what your question is about. I had a letter not that long ago, I'd say 6 years ago. I guess to college students, that's a long time ago. I just thought of that. That's like I was in preschool or something. But to me, it doesn't seem that long ago. It was from a 26-year-old woman in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's my home state. She was an elementary school teacher. And she said, "Dear Mr. O'Brien, I've been meaning to write you for years and years now, but now I think I really have to." She said when she was a little girl growing up in a suburb of Minneapolis, she lived in a household with a father who was pretty much dead silent. He was just a silent, angry, embittered man. She said as a little girl, she feared going to the dinner table. She didn't like going to dinner because her dad would stare down at his plate and the veins in his neck would stick out and his face would go red. And he wouldn't even look at her. At one point when she was a little older, she went into the basement of the house and she found a little box that was filled with relics of her father's service in Vietnam. Medals and faded snapshots, and there was a stripper's bra that was in there that had come off some, Filipino, they had floor shows that would come entertain the troops, all these strange relics of the war. And she realized then that her dad had been in the war, and that's what was making him quiet and not being a normal father. She said as she got into junior high school, she felt more like a counselor than a daughter. She said at one point her mom told her, "I've never really loved your father." And the little girl said, "What? Why did you marry him?" And the mother said, "Oh, I married him out of pity. We'd had a few dates in college, and he went off to the war, and he came back, the guy you see, and I married him because I pitied him." Then the letter, which was a long, I'm rushing through a 50-page letter. This was a long letter. I'm on page 48 now. but she said, near the end of her letter, she said one day when she was in high school, she was assigned the things they carried in AP English class, and she brought it home, read it, and then left it on a coffee table in the living room. And her father saw it and began reading it. And that night at the dinner table, he said a few things about his own time as a soldier. And the mother said something about being the girlfriend of a soldier who meets a different human being coming home. And the next night there was more talk, and the next night a little more. She ended her letter to me by saying, "My mom and dad still aren't perfect. They have their troubles, but they're still together." And she said, "I don't think they would have been if that book had not been lying on that coffee table." Well, what do you say? I didn't intend to save the marriage or help these particular, I didn't even know them. But literature now and then can go beyond the classroom, and it can go beyond assignments, it can go beyond required reading. It can do things to human spirits that are real. You can touch people in unexpected ways. That father did not expect to be touched or to be moved out of his silence. But literature can sometimes do that. I know that when I'm assigned things to read, I'd go into them kind of reluctantly, and sometimes love them, but often don't, partly because I'm made to read them. But there are times when literature does exactly the reverse. It really binds itself to the human soul. This is one example. I'm not even sure of time now. I'm not sure what I should do. Should I wrap it up now? Or?
Thank you, Tim. I think it's time for us to.
I want to say thanks for everybody for coming.
Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you.